Maria Bickford counted her rooms in a letter to a friend back home in Maine. 4. All to herself, a tenement by itself with nobody else in it, and she had got a beautiful carpet, a rocking chair, and a card table with a covering for it. She was 21. On the morning of the 27th of October, 1845, the people who kept the house on Cedar Lane heard her scream once, and then a heavy fall, and somebody came down the stairs and went out through the front door. The house stood in the west end of Boston, on a lane behind Beacon Hill, in a city with numerous daily papers, the cheapest of which lived on local crime. By 9 o'clock that morning, the Boston Daily Mail had a second edition on the street. The masthead carried a woodcut of a rider on a galloping horse, a banner streaming out behind him with the word news on it, and beneath it the day and the hour. The paper reported that a woman had been killed at a house in Cedar Lane at about 4 in the morning. The bed had afterwards been set on fire to conceal what had been done. Then, in the same column, the Mail wrote that it had been requested not to give further particulars until the coroner's inquest was held. It trusted the inquest would develop the mysteries of the affair and bring the murderer to justice. The restraint did not survive the afternoon. Before the inquest sat, before a single person had been questioned under oath, the paper's reporter had reached a conclusion and printed it. He named a young man from Weymouth, Albert J. Tyrrell, the son of a shoe manufacturer, who had been keeping the dead woman, and who had been seen in her room the evening before. Some articles of men's clothing had been found there, along with a letter addressed in initials, AJT to MAB. The coroner's jury would not meet until the following day. She had been born Mary Ann Dunn at Bath in Maine on the 19th of June, 1824. Her father died while she was still a child, and she moved with her mother to Bangor. At 15, she went into service in a house there. In March 1840, at 16, she married a shoemaker named James Bickford at Brewer, and the following year she had a daughter. The child died in infancy. In May 1842, some women friends of the family were going down to Boston and asked her to come with them. She was 17. Almost everything known about that spring comes, in the first instance, from her husband. While she was in the city, he said afterwards, she appeared delighted with everything she saw, and on her return home she expressed a desire to reside permanently in Boston. She talked about the jewelry and the goods in the shop windows on Washington Street. She talked about fine houses, fine carriages, ladies in fine dresses. He said she came back an altered woman, dissatisfied with her humble and retired condition. She had always been fond of dress, and his own means would never run to the appearance she wanted to make. That October she left him and went to Massachusetts with another man who did not keep her long. She took work at a factory in Newburyport and found it too hard. She fell sick, fell into debt, and wrote asking her husband for money. Then she wrote him a shorter letter. She could not tell him where she was living, she said, because the people she boarded with did not know she had a husband. She would keep house with him again if she could have her liberty. What happened when he came for her is told two ways. One account has him finding work in a boot factory in Boston, meeting her and agreeing to set up a household together, an agreement broken inside a few days. Another has him finding her in a house of ill repute on North Margin Street and going back to Maine on his own. By 1844, she was writing to the same friend in Maine with a very different kind of news. She was riding out with the handsomest fellow that Boston affords. They had 3 of the most magnificent robes, the sort you could not get down east. He had bought her a splendid foot muff, and there was a sleigh, and 2 of the finest horses she had ever seen. His coat was light velvet, and there was not another like it in the city, and it attracted attention, she could tell you that. He was, she wrote, the richest man's son in Boston. I tell you we make Washington Street tremble. She meant to bring him home with her when she came. To her husband she put the same thing more plainly. She could not bear the idea of living so retired. she told him after seeing so much genteel company. The man in that letter is called only Frank. The one who came after him is better documented. Albert Tyrrell was the son of a Weymouth shoe manufacturer, married, with children at home, and in 1845 he left them for her. The two of them traveled as husband and wife and changed their names when they moved. In 1844, they went as far as New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, taking a friend of his with them, and that friend would later be a witness at his trial. In Boston, she kept a house of her own under the name Maria Welsh. A woman who boarded near her remembered that she said she liked quarreling with him because of the good time they had making up afterwards. Among the things he bought her was a satin dress. The pamphlet published the year after her death put its price at $100. She was wearing it when she sat for a daguerreotype portrait, a small plate in a case. That portrait was in her room on the morning she died. By October 1845, she was living in a boarding house on Cedar Lane, in the West End. The lane went by two other names as well. Some people called it Pinckney Lane, and some called it Mount Vernon Avenue. Joel Lawrence and his wife had kept the house for years and had lately been using it as a house of assignation. Places of that sort charged high rents to couples living as husband and wife without being married, which was itself an offense in Massachusetts and one that could be prosecuted. There is an odd sentence in the Mail's first report of her death. The paper wrote that the house had recently been occupied by a woman whom it named, the notorious Julia King. Then it added a line of its own. Of the present character of the house, we are not informed. It printed the name of a woman who had gone, and declined to say what the place had since become, in a report about a woman who had died in it that morning. Tyrrell had been indicted a month earlier, on the 29th of September, for adultery. He avoided arrest for some weeks. After he was taken and arraigned, his relatives wrote to the prosecutor, and so did his young wife, asking for a stay of proceedings in the hope that he might yet be reformed. The trial was put off for 6 months. He posted his bond and was let out, and he went straight back to Cedar Lane. On the 26th of October, he was in her room again. That afternoon, one of the people living in the house heard the two of them exchanging angry words. Tyrrell went out. He came back that evening and was seen upstairs with her at about 9 o'clock. Somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, the Lawrences and a girl who lived in the house heard a shriek overhead, then a heavy thud. Then somebody stumbled down the stairs and out through the door of the building. The first edition of the Mail put the hour at 4. A later account put it at 5. They found her in the upstairs room, and several separate fires had been set in it. There was a blood-stained razor at the foot of the bed and a washbowl standing near. The walls had been spattered. The rest of the room had not been touched. A small work table stood a little way from the bed, with its drawer partly open, and in the drawer were the rings and trinkets she had been wearing the day before. On the mantel, arranged with what one reporter called the most scrupulous neatness, were various costly articles of perfumery and cosmetics. Underneath the mantel stood a small open trunk, holding a bundle of letters that appeared to have been received quite recently. One of those letters was signed "An Affectionate Mother." There were prints in neat gilt frames on the wall by the bed, and over one of the pillows lay the daguerreotype, the one taken in a riding dress and cap. At about 5:30, a man answering Tyrrell's description came to a livery stable nearby and asked for a horse to carry him out of town. He had got into a little difficulty, he said. A woman named Mary Head, who lived close to the boarding house, said afterwards that he had come to her door that same morning. He had asked whether there were some things there for him, and the state he was in had frightened her. By that evening he was in Weymouth, at the house of his wife's people, who hid him and gave him money to get out of the state. He went north into Canada and wrote from Montreal that he was bound for Liverpool. Bad weather turned the ship back. He took passage from New York for New Orleans instead, and on the 5th of December, or the 6th, the accounts differ, the Louisiana authorities came aboard and arrested him. The Boston papers reported the capture of Albert J. Tyrrell, gentleman of Weymouth. The extra edition had come out at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of her death. The same reporter who had described the blood and the burning went on, in the last paragraphs of the same story, to describe her table. Everything in the room, he wrote, testified to the sex and taste of its unfortunate occupant. There was a work-box and cosmetics of various kinds, and a parasol, and a pair of white kid gloves, and one shoe of delicate dimensions, lying carelessly on the table, as though their owner had just left them. It was truly a painful spectacle, he wrote, and not one that would readily be effaced from the memory of those who looked upon it. Out of a parasol and a pair of gloves he had built a woman of refined feeling. Inside 12 hours, the coroner's jury sat the next day. It concluded that she had been murdered by her illicit lover, Albert Tyrrell, who was by then gone. For weeks afterwards, the papers printed one false report after another about where he had got to. They also went to work on her. On the 6th of December, the Mail published an account taken from an interview with a relative of the man who would stand trial for her death in March. In that telling, Tyrrell was an unfortunate young man, naturally generous, warm-hearted, affectionate to his friends. He would probably have become a useful and respected member of society, but for the terrible influence of a depraved and fascinating woman. Her selfish extravagance and riotous living, the relative said, had despoiled her victim of every dollar of his patrimony. The Boston Daily Whig had already gone further. It went to a slightly better class of subscriber, and it reported that she had been responsible for the deaths of at least 2 men, one of them stabbed and then poisoned. It attacked the Mail directly for trying to drum up sympathy for her. No copy of that issue of the Whig has been found. What is known of it comes from a reprint that appeared in a New York crime paper a fortnight later. The 2 accounts of her ran in the same newspaper 6 weeks apart, and neither of them mentioned the other. The murder trial opened in Boston in March 1846. By the second day, a defense witness was giving the court the prices of her clothes. At his house, he said, she had a white satin dress that cost $2.50 a yard and a velvet dress that cost $55. She had more good dresses than he had ever known any woman to have, and she had told him Albert bought them for her. Another described a bonnet she had taken at the Franklin house in April and stamped on in a temper. It had cost $15. A bonnet counted stylish and expensive could be had in an American city in those years for $7 or $8, about half. The catalog went on. Grapes thrown about the room when they did not suit her, a washbowl thrown at him at Congress Hall in Philadelphia, a decanter of liquor into the fireplace, laudanum twice. Every one of these accounts came from friends and relatives of Albert Tyrrell, called to the stand by his own counsel. The defense had 3 lines and ran all of them at once. She had done it herself, or somebody else had done it, and a fireman said Joel Lawrence had at first tried to keep him out of the room that morning, or Tyrrell had done it in his sleep. Much of the rest was aimed at the character of the Lawrences and their lodgers, and a good deal of it was ruled out as hearsay after the jury had heard it. The prosecution had a difficulty of its own. The physician who attended the coroner conceded, under questioning, that the wound could have been made by her own hand. Annis Merrill, junior counsel for the defense, put it in one sentence: suicide was almost the natural death of a woman of her character. For that to hold, the jury needed to hear something like it from her. The defense called a man who had spent an afternoon with the 2 of them in a room at Exeter, in New Hampshire. The room he described was upstairs, and Maria Bickford was standing in front of the looking-glass in a white satin dress. Albert was sitting where he could watch her. He leaned across to the witness and spoke low, quietly enough that she would not catch it. "See her beautiful feet," he said. "See her beautiful form. And what a beautiful figure she had." She turned round from the glass and asked the witness how he liked the dress. Then she said she did not like it herself. She would have a blue-black silk dress instead. And she told Albert, in front of the visitor, that if she did not have everything she wanted while she was with him, she would cut her own throat. The men who described that afternoon had been present for the rest of it, too. He bought her grapes, and when they did not suit her, she threw them about the room. When she flew up and quarreled with him, he would say, "Maria, don't quarrel. I will do anything for you." She could do anything she pleased with him, one of them said. Another had known her 15 months and described her as sometimes calm and pleasant, then all at once in a high state of excitement. The woman who had boarded near them in Boston remembered her saying, "She liked the quarrels for the sake of the making up." She had been describing the same household from the other side of the wall. In her account, it was a kind of pleasure, the sort of thing a young woman says about a man she is not going to leave. Repeated in a courtroom by people who had come to speak for the man on trial, the same behavior became a record of violence in the house, and the violence was hers. She had been dead 5 months by the time any of this was said aloud. Her sentence about her own throat now sat beside something else the jury had heard. The coroner's physician conceding, under questioning, that the wound could have been made by her own hand. No witness was asked to connect the two. None did. What had happened at Exeter was that a young woman looked at herself in a dress she had been given, said she would rather have had another, and lost her temper in front of a stranger. She was 21 when she died. Later in the trial, the defense called 12 witnesses on the subject of sleep. All of them were friends or relatives of the prisoner. He had walked in his sleep since he was 6 years old, and it had grown worse with each passing year. In the night, he had taken hold of his brother, pulled down curtains, broken windows. One cousin described being hauled out of bed by him in September, a month before her death, with a knife in his hand. In that state, several of them said, he always spoke in a shrill, trembling voice. Then Walter Channing, dean of the medical school at Harvard, told the court that a man in such a condition could rise in the night, dress himself, commit a killing, set a fire, and get away. There was no settled medical account of sleepwalking in the 1840s. Physicians differed over whether to call it a disease, a disorder of the mind, or a form of insanity. The defense then read to the jury from popular books describing violence done by sleepers. Rufus Choate, who had been a United States Senator, spoke for about 6 hours across 2 days. He took the prosecution apart in a chain of questions and answers, and the answer every time was no. No one had seen the blow struck. No one had seen the prisoner in that house after 9 the previous evening. No one had seen him run from it, or seen a drop of blood upon his hands. No one could say that on that night he had not been laboring under the affliction he had carried since boyhood. Nothing of that speech was taken down. One stenographer of the day said afterwards that a man might as well be asked to report lightning. The jury was made up of tradesmen. There were 2 housewrights, a mason, a mast-maker, a furniture dealer, a druggist, and a clerk. They were of the sort that read the penny papers, and the penny papers had printed both of the women. On the 4th day, the judge charged them for an hour and a half. By one description of it, he spoke of the depraved character of the dead woman and told them that sleepwalking was to be understood as a species of insanity. The charge was taken to favor the defense. The trial had run 4.5 days. After all of it, the jury was out 2 hours. Not guilty. The crowd packed into the courtroom and, standing in the street outside, answered with cheers and applause. A Boston crowd had answered the same way 10 years earlier, at the acquittal of another young man of family, for the death of another woman of the town. In January 1847, Tyrrell was tried a second time, for arson, which was then a capital offense in Massachusetts. The prosecution brought essentially the same witnesses. Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw instructed that jury as well. He described the prosecution's witnesses as persons of disreputable character and pointed to the discrepancies in what they had said. Tyrrell was acquitted again. Afterwards, he wrote to Rufus Choate asking him to give back half his fee, on the ground that his innocence had been so obvious that the work could not have been difficult. Choate declined. Tyrrell lived another 33 years and died in 1880, out of public view. What he was finally punished for was adultery and lascivious cohabitation. Some accounts of the case give him 3 years in the state prison for those offenses, and others end at the second acquittal and mention no sentence at all. Either way, nothing he was ever convicted of had anything to do with her death. The charge that may have put him in prison was living with her. In June 1846, 8 months after she died, a pamphlet went on sale in Boston. It ran to 48 pages and cost 12.5 cents a copy. The advertisements ran in boldface. "The truth must be told," they said, "and let the guilty squirm." They promised astounding facts implicating well-known individuals conspicuous in the fashionable circles of Boston and undertook to show that persons of wealthy and aristocratic origin had acted a prominent part in her ruin. One notice added that all classes might be instructed and benefited by a perusal of it. What the buyer actually got was her letters. The ones to her husband, the one about the sleigh and the velvet coat and Washington Street, the one about the 4 rooms and the carpet and the card table with its covering. They were all in there, with passages of biography written in between to link them up, and the whole of it ran under her name. The correspondence had been supplied to the publisher by her husband, and the narrative between the letters was written from what he told the compiler. The first printing sold out in a rush. A new edition was in the periodical depots inside the week, and an abridged 4th edition followed. On the cover was an engraving of her, seated in the satin dress. 2 Boston artists had cut it from the daguerreotype. There is a difficulty about that plate. One account of the morning of her death describes it lying over her pillow, and the note printed beneath the engraving says the coroner took it out of her trunk. Both cannot be right, and no third account settles it. The note under the engraving assured the reader that the facsimile of the superb satin dress she was wearing had been executed with remarkable fidelity. The dress, it added, was reported to have cost $100 and to have been presented to her by Albert J. Tyrrell. At the end of December 1846, a traveling wax museum opened for business on Washington Street, a few doors along from the Old South Church. Its statues and tableaus were shown to the clatter of a drum, a fiddle, and a banjo, the instruments that belonged in that period to the dancing saloons. 2 of the featured attractions were wax figures of Albert J. Tyrrell and Maria A. Bickford. 14 months had passed since the morning on Cedar Lane. The advertisements that ran in the Boston papers in January concentrated on hers. Her figure, the notices said, would be dressed in the identical dress that was given her by Tyrrell and which cost so much money. It would wear the jewelry and other ornaments worn by her in Boston, all of which had been obtained of Mr. James Bickford at a great cost. The notices ran on the 11th of January, 1847, and again 2 days later. By then her husband had supplied her letters to one publisher and her clothes to another. Washington Street was the one she had come home talking about in the spring of 1842, when she was 17. It was the one with the shop windows in it, the gorgeous jewelry, and the splendid goods of every description that she would refer to and refer to again. She had told her husband she wanted to remain there permanently. She had always been passionately fond of dress, he said afterwards, and his means would not permit her to make the appearance she so much desired to make. It was a great source of vexation to her. She had been 21. She was born Mary Ann Dunn at Bath, in Maine, on the 19th of June, 1824.